Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, fellow history folks. Hope everybody is doing really well this evening here on April 14th, 2024, Sunday night history chat. Excited that everybody is here this evening, and we're going to see what kind of trouble we can get into. Probably not much trouble. But I hope everybody is doing well wherever it is that you happen to be watching or listening from this evening. If you get a chance, drop that information in the comments. Just say hi. I'd like to say hi to everyone this evening who's out there hanging out. And I mean, I just hope your week's gone really well. Really well. Been doing lots of history down here, a lot of work on that aviation book. Really excited and to see where that's going. About 17,000 words into it out of probably 47,000 words. So 30,000 words left to write. That's just the way it goes. We should be, the time traveling Hardy should be at the Blockhouse in Duffield, Virginia. I think that is Natural Bridge State Park. Is that right, Elizabeth? Natural Tunnel State Park. Anyway, it's in Duffield, Virginia. We're supposed to be there Saturday and Sunday, talking a little Revolutionary War history. If you are out and about, please come join us. Would love to have you out there just sharing with us. There'll be a bunch of interpreters out there talking about different parts of the colonial experience. And of course, I will be one of those runaways once again. I think I get to talk about the Stamp Act. And Elizabeth is going to be talking about Sugar and Molasses Act, and Isabella is going to be in the tavern. You got to watch out for that one. She's pretty mean. But hope everybody is doing well. There's our friends Hardy and David and Riley and Adam and Bobby Joe Goodson in Arkansas and Gavin down the mountain from me and Niels in Greensboro and Ryan, excuse me, in Alabama and Robert and Jason. Hope y'all have had a great week and done lots of great historical things out there and about this past week. Robert, update from other book releases. No, I don't have any updates. Ted Savas says Feeding the A&V will be out in the January, and Plymouth book will be out toward the end of next year, and this aviation book will not be out until next year. So next year is going to be really busy for me. Which is good. I like that. I love being out talking about history, but all kinds of projects going on. Should be a new post up tomorrow, which we're going to talk about here in a couple of minutes. Up on looking for the Confederate War. Haven't had one. It's kind of hard for me to jump time periods. I know I do that a lot, but I'm trying to really focus on this aviation project. And not spent a whole lot of time in the 1860s, but I did this afternoon. And so we're going to jump into that discussion right now and talk a little bit. Of course, many of you have seen there's a lot of stuff going on. 159th anniversary of Appomattox, the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia at Appomattox. And whole lot of other stuff going on. We'll have Bentonville toward the end of the month, and just a lot of events. A lot of our friends were at Appomattox this past weekend. Tom Jesse and Kirk Fields. John Weinberger was at Appomattox this weekend. There was also a symposium about, I think it was in Newmarket, about the Shenandoah Valley in the war. Our friend Charlie Knight was there, and Dave Powell was there at that event. So just check it out. Lots of stuff going on. So with all of that running around, I was thinking, what happened to all of the Confederate governors at the end of the war? And I couldn't really find a good list online. And so I spent some time this afternoon creating one of those lists. I know I like to create lists, but this is not a bullet point list. I wanted to know about what happened to all of these governors at the end of the war. And my rough count right now is that 7 were arrested. Of those 7 that were arrested, 2 of them were held at Fort Pulaski in Savannah, Georgia. 3 of them were at the Old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. And then another 5 of the Confederate governors fled at the end of the war. So let's run through. Let's take a couple minutes and let's talk about some of these men. Alabama had 3 governors during the war, and when I say 3 governors, most states had a term limit, a constitutional term limit. Their state constitutions would say, it's not true for all states, but some states would say this man can only serve 2 terms, or however many years. And so that's why we get quite a bit of turnover during the war years. Now, some of these men were voted out of office. We probably won't get into a whole lot of this evening. You could probably learn more tomorrow when I post this on Looking for the Confederate War. Alabama had 3 governors. Andrew B. Moore was the first in the wartime. John G. Shortner was second. And Thomas H. Watts was third. Watts actually was a Confederate attorney general for a portion of the war, but he doesn't. Well, let me back up. Moore was arrested on May 16th, 1865, and imprisoned at Fort Pulaski until August of 1865. Shortner apparently avoids arrest. Watts was arrested May 1st of 1865, sent to Macon, but appears to have been released by mid-June. I can't so far find him any place. I need to do a little more research on that. Arkansas had 3 men in the governor's chair. We have Henry M. Rector, but he resigned right after losing an election on November 4th, 1862. And then President of the Senate, Thomas Fletcher, would serve about 2 weeks when Harris Flanagan was elected. And Flanagan served until May 26, 1865, more or less as a governor in exile there in Arkansas. I can't find where any of those men were arrested or did jail time, prison time at the end of the war. Florida had 2 governors, Madison S. Perry and John Milton. Perry, Florida is one of those states, and where you can only serve a limited amount of terms. And after his 2 terms, Perry actually goes on to be colonel of the 7th Florida Infantry, but his health was bad, and he goes back to Florida, where he dies in March of 1865. John Milton takes Perry's place as governor, and realizing that the war is over, kills himself on April 1st, 1865. Georgia had 1 governor during the war, probably the second, y'all may disagree with me on this, but probably the second most famous governor of the wartime, and that is Joseph E. Brown. He was in office from November 6th, 1857 to June 17th, 1865, when he resigned. He actually was arrested on May 23rd and imprisoned at Old Capitol Prison in Washington, D.C. He somehow finagles a meeting with Andrew Johnson, who's then president of the United States, and he is released shortly thereafter. It's weird that he was actually arrested before he resigned. Not that the federal government cared anything about that, but that's one of those little things. He's probably the second most famous governor of the war. We can hash that out later. Kentucky is complicated. It's a border state. Sorry, Elizabeth. Elizabeth grew up in Kentucky, went to University of Louisville, but it is complicated. So George W. Johnson was the first Confederate governor. He more or less kind of serves on the staff of Breckinridge. They just kind of bounce around all over the place. I think Johnson's story is probably one of the most interesting. He attaches himself to Breckinridge's staff, and they're at the Battle of Shiloh, and at Shiloh his horse was shot from underneath him, and Johnson refused to take another horse, and he actually attaches himself to the 4th Kentucky Infantry U.S., and Governor Johnson is mortally wounded on the afternoon of April 7th, 1862. A bullet passes through his body while he is fighting, and he dies 2 days later. Elizabeth, you ever heard that story?
Yeah.
Okay. She had never heard that story. Probably not taught in Kentucky schools. He is replaced by Richard Hawes, who was selected by the state council as Johnson's replacement. And Hawes makes his headquarters with the Army of Tennessee, and he returns home at the end of the war, and that appears to be the end of that story. Louisiana had two governors, John Pettus and Charles Clark. At the end of the war, Pettus was wanted for questioning in Lincoln's assassination, and he went into hiding, and he apparently tried to gain his parole on 3 different times, and it was rejected all 3 times, and he dies of pneumonia in Arkansas on January 28th of 1867. Clark was arrested. Governor Clark, Charles Clark, was arrested and imprisoned at Fort Pulaski, and finally took the oath of allegiance in September of 1865. Moving on, Missouri. Claiborne F. Jackson took the oath of office on January 3rd, 1861, but after June of 1861 is more or less a governor in exile. He was actually deposed by the General Assembly in July of 1861, and he kind of bounces around between various military commanders and places during the course of the next few months. He dies in Little Rock, Arkansas on December 7th, 1861. And then Lieutenant Governor Thomas C. Reynolds assumes the role of the governor, but really didn't play a large part in political affairs. After the war is over, he goes to Mexico. Long list of people that go to Mexico from this short list of governors, but does eventually return to St. Louis. And then probably the most famous governor of the wartime comes from North Carolina, but it is not the first 2 governors. And when I say famous, or we hear more about Governor Joseph Brown from Georgia and Zebulon Baird Vance and their conflicts and their work on trying to preserve state rights than we do other governors. So it's not that they are not other governors are not as important, but we hear more about them. But North Carolina had 3 wartime governors. John W. Ellis, of course, is the man who tells Lincoln you can get no troops from North Carolina. He dies he's sick, and he tells Lincoln that we can get no troops in May of 1861, and then he dies in July of 1861. We do not have a lieutenant governor in North Carolina, so the Speaker of the North Carolina Senate, Henry T. Clark, takes that office, but Clark decides not to run. He serves out the rest of Ellis's term, but does not run for nomination and for governor of the state of North Carolina after that. That position is Zebulon Baird Vance, Colonel of the 26th North Carolina, and he was elected twice during the war years. After the war, he actually sends a note to Sherman, William T. Sherman, and goes, "What should I do?" And Sherman just basically says, "Just go home." And Vance didn't really have a home, so he went to Statesville, North Carolina, where he is arrested on his birthday, May 13th, 1865, and is imprisoned at the old Capitol Prison and receives his parole on July 6, 1865. Vance is the whole reason why this post and our discussion tonight exists, because today is the day that Vance dies. It's the date of Vance's death. And I haven't looked yet, and I'm not going to beat this horse this evening, but I'm curious if the Zebulon Baird Vance State Historic Site has done anything to mention Vance on the day that he died. We'll be looking after we get done this evening, and I'll probably be making a post about that, but y'all all know that song and dance. South Carolina had 3 men as governor: Francis W. Pickens, Millage L. Bonham, and Andrew J. McGrath. Pickens and Bonham were once again limited by their state constitution about how many terms they could serve. Pickens retires to his plantation after his end of his terms. And after Bonham's term, he is reappointed as Confederate general and serves with the Army of Tennessee. McGrath was arrested and imprisoned at Fort Pulaski and was not released until December of 1865. McGrath would be the person who was imprisoned, of the Confederate governors, the person who was imprisoned the longest at the end of the war. Tennessee only has one Confederate governor, and that is Isham G. Harris. After the fall of Nashville in 1862, Harris, they go to Memphis for a short amount of time, but Harris basically attaches himself to the Confederate Army. He's on the staff of Albert S. Johnson and Joseph E. Johnston and Braxton Bragg. So he's bouncing around. Harris is the only one that I could find that the U.S. government, and y'all correct me if there's another one, but the U.S. government actually put a $5,000 reward out for Harris. I haven't found that on any of the rest of them, but it's entirely possible. Harris once again went to Mexico after the end of the war, and then England, and then only returned to the state of Tennessee once the bounty was removed off of him. I want to know more about this bounty. Was it issued for the other ones that went into exile? I don't know that. Texas had 4 men who served as governor. Sam Houston is the first during the war years. He was removed in March of 1861 for his pro-union stance. Edward Clark, the lieutenant governor, lost the election. He assumes the governorship, but then he loses the election in November of 1861, and he is replaced by Francis Lubbock. Lubbock serves until November of 1863, but does not run for re-election, and is replaced by Pendleton Murrah. Of course, Houston died in 1863. Clark served after he was governor. He served as colonel of the 14th Texas Infantry, but fled to Mexico at the end of the war. Lubbock was commissioned lieutenant colonel on the staff of Prince John Magruder, and then as an aide-de-camp for Jefferson Davis. Lubbock is actually captured with Davis just outside of Dublin, Georgia, and then they are both imprisoned at Fort Delaware, and Lubbock is there for 8 months. So Lubbock probably would be the second longest governor to have been imprisoned after the war. Virginia has 2 wartime governors, John Letcher and William Smith. Letcher's, I find this interesting. Letcher's arrest order was issued by Grant. Whereas, if you remember, when I first started talking this evening, Governor from the state of Alabama, Watts's arrest warrant was issued by Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. So that needs a lot more research. Once again, the bounty thing needs more research too. But Letcher is arrested on May 20th, 1865. And is imprisoned at Old Capitol Prison. He was released 47 days later. And then Smith, Extra Billy Smith here is, I found some conflicting things. I found one thing when I was doing my research that said that he was arrested in May of 1865 and then paroled on June 8th. But I found a couple of other things that said that he turned himself in on June 8th, 1865, and was paroled the same day. So I'm not so sure. I kind of lean toward him turning himself in and was paroled on June 8th. But I'm not really sure about that. David Pope was writing about Harris serving as United States Senator. There were many of these people who, there were some of these men who were governors who went on to serve as politicians after the war. That's probably a different discussion to have. And I think I even have a blog post about that someplace. So, of that list of governors, I have 7 that were arrested, 4 that went to Fort Pulaski, 3 that went to the old Capitol prison. I have 5 that went into exile. I have 1 that was imprisoned at Fort Delaware, 1 that was basically just hid out and avoided the governor, avoided everyone, and then 5 who died during the course of the war, like Sam Houston and John Milton. They died. 2 at Fort Pulaski, 3 at Old Capitol Prison, 1 at Fort Delaware. So I don't know. Do you find that interesting? One of those crazy thoughts that I had today as I was bumping around. I've actually worked a lot outside of the house, like at my other job the past couple of days, Friday and Saturday, and I've been kind of tired and not felt good. But I had a great time. But that's just kind of one of those things that ran through my head as I was bumping around this afternoon. What happened to these governors at the end of the war? And as I said, the bounty thing, I'd like to have more information on. A lot of these men were arrested. Some of these men were arrested because they thought that there was this big tie-in to the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And that is why some of these men were incarcerated at the end of the war. Of course, the papers from the Confederate War Department wound up in Charlotte. They were given to the federal commander down there, and they were put on a train, and that train went to the coast of North Carolina and put on a steamship, and were taken to D.C., and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton and other people actually went through these papers trying to find links to the assassination of Jefferson Davis, which they never did. Of course, the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, not Jefferson Davis. We, of course, are sitting at that 159th anniversary of that event as well. Could probably have a really good discussion on whether Davis and the Confederate government was in on that or not. That's one of those unsolved history's mysteries. Yeah, it's also just a bad day in history. The day the Titanic went down, the day the Donner Party left. You've probably seen all of that out there running around. Gary wants to know, can you flesh out any evidence you've come across about how the various Confederate state governors evidenced the issue of states' rights separate from any connection to slavery? I'll be really honest, my Australian friend. I have really only dived deep into North Carolina. And even though I have books and biographies on other Confederate governors, in fact, there is a book by Buck Yearns called The Confederate Governors. It's actually edited by him, that the University of Georgia Press printed in 19 something. I think it's 85. That's the only book I know of on all the governors at one time. A lot of these governors, and I have a link to this, a blog to this as well, that there are no biographies on some of these men. I think it's a state by state thing. You know, some states make that tie in their secession documents to slavery. Other states like North Carolina and Tennessee do not. I think South Carolina is the state that have 2 different documents, one that does that and one that does not, both issued at the same time. So that's probably a post for another piece of time. And there's a lot of stuff on the internet out there about that. Some of it you have to read with a discerning eye. I, of course, find the discussion much more centered around the Constitution. The Republicans in their party platform of 1860 were doing a lot of things the Constitution really didn't allow them to do. We're proposing to do a lot of things the Constitution really didn't allow them to do. Retarding or telling a state that it could not have slavery is one of those things the Constitution did not give the federal government to do. So we'll save that for another time and dive deep into that. David Pope's again trying to tell me how to pronounce something. It doesn't ever work.
Good luck, David.
Good luck, David, because Elizabeth's been trying for almost 30 years, 29 years. She'll like, you don't say it that way, say it like this. And it just comes out that way. My tongue just works in different directions. But Confederate governors, we don't, so many people study battles, and we could, I mean, there are many entire discussions that are just about Gettysburg or Sharpsburg or some of these other battles, and state politics, which are hugely important, not just in the South, but in the North as well. Don't get a lot of airtime these days. Something to think about. So if there's something else about governors you want to talk about, drop it in the comments this evening. Otherwise, we'll probably be kind of brief. I do have some other special speakers coming up, probably the first Sunday night in May. I may or may not be here. We may not be back next Sunday night. That'll be a minute-by-minute decision. As I mentioned earlier, we'll be working for the state of Virginia next weekend. So we'll have to make that call later on the afternoon. You will be able to read more of this tomorrow when I get this post up. And I encourage you to check it out over on Looking for the Confederate War. Our friend Jason's reading book about Railroads Confederacy by Black. It is a fantastic read. And I encourage you to check that book out. Railroads of the Confederacy by Black. It's a standard source. If it's not on your shelf, it should be. And he makes a great point about the state being able to control the railroads because, that's the state's responsibility. The federal government, the federal Constitution does not say a state the federal Constitution does not say that the federal government can control the railroads. Early in the war, the Lincoln administration seizes basically the railroads up north. The Confederate government does not do that until toward the end of the war, and the Southern Railroads struggle. All these different gauges and things running around. If you had a shipment of stuff on the railroad coming from South Carolina into North Carolina, when you got to Charlotte, the gauge of the railroad switched. So everything had to be unloaded off of one train, and put on a different train to continue the journey north or south. So lots of cool things and interesting things to discover. And once again, check out Buck Yearns' book, The Confederate Governors. Once again, probably one of those books that needs to be on your Confederate bookshelf, along with Black's books on railroads in the Confederacy. That also needs to be on your Confederate bookshelf. We need to do just a single post, Elizabeth, about books that need to be on your Confederate bookshelf. That would be a cool post and a cool evening to spend. I would be interested in your thoughts and give you my thoughts. And of course, we talk about books all the time, and I recommend books. In fact, I got a new book to read for review just a few days ago. Looking forward to it. It's on the Confederate Navy Medical Corps. That's just came in a couple of days ago, and I get to read it for review on emerging Civil War. And we need to get started soon, but we'll see where that goes. Any other thoughts or comments out there? Let me encourage you to drop them in the box. Otherwise, we'll probably sign off, and I'm going to mosey upstairs. And Agriculture of the Confederacy, Jason has. Yes, that's on my Confederate bookshelf. The gauge in Rock Hill, South Carolina, would have been different than the one coming into Charlotte. So that's another fascinating thing about all these various railroads. And they did that. They did that with the railroads to control their little part of the world, the railroad presidents. But that's a long story. David Pope's working on a new project about East Tennessee Confederates. I look forward to see what he digs out. I have been doing some work and going to be doing some speaking of the war in East Tennessee. Not exactly East Tennessee, but it is East Tennessee, on what we sometimes call the Laurel War, or the Shelton. The more popular name is the Shelton War Massacre. And while I will talk about that event in January of 1863, I'm going to do a more broader look at this war as a whole. And part of the war actually comes from the bridge burnings in East Tennessee, the beginning of it, and some of those men that fled into Madison County, North Carolina. And I will be on the road in a few select locations in East Tennessee, and just booked one for Anderson, South Carolina, and the Civil War Roundtable in Harrisburg, Virginia, and then eventually the Roundtable in Cobb County, Georgia, and then some other SCV camps, the camp in Kingsport, and the camp in Newport, Tennessee, and camps in High Point, and Asheville, and Greensboro, and I don't remember anymore. That's all I got. There's probably are more to that list, but that's all I remember right now. Our friend in Arkansas, yeah, full eclipses are pretty awesome. And we saw, we were at 80% here in Western North Carolina, and worked really good up until we could see it all the way till it got to where our whole 80% was. And then the clouds took over and we didn't see much after that. I went in the house. Yes, anything in there. Jason Bouchures, good to see you this evening. Anything with feeding, supplying, moving, caring for the troops. You're right. That's all fascinating stuff. And maybe one day my Feeding the Army of Northern Virginia book will be out. God's got a plan. I'm not sure what it is, why I have to wait 4 years, but that's okay. I've been working on other stuff. So if you don't have the book Confederate Supply, please check that book out. That book is superb. It's published by Duke University Press, I think back in the 60s. If you need the author's name, I don't have it right here in front of me, even though it's on the shelf. It's on the shelf back there someplace. I've been doing rearranging, so I know it's on that shelf, but I can't just reach back and pull it off right now. But Confederate Supply is a superb book. Needs to be on your Confederate bookshelf. Why didn't Longstreet attack Burnside at Lenore City on November 14th of 63? I don't remember enough about that discussion right now to dive in there. But hey, who knows what thing will run across my mind and I'll write about next, because that's kind of like today's post about Confederate governors and what happened to them at the end of the war. Which ones fled, went into exile, which ones were arrested, how long they were arrested. I think I have a book on Campbell Station. Bobby Joe Goodson, are we talking about eclipses? We had one back in 2017 here that was total. That's pretty cool. And, you know, we talk a lot about that. Given my night job, we talk a lot about the eclipse and things like that. It's not a very big book that I remember. David Pope about Campbell Station. It's over there someplace. Oh, food supplies. Oh, yeah, we talk about food supplies a lot because I wrote a book on it. I may write more on it. We'll see. Fascinating subject, though, supplies and logistics during the war. Battles are fascinating, but logistics are not as glamorous or sexy as writing about battles, but extremely important. Extremely. David Pope, I don't remember who it's by. Sorry. Got a whole shelf of books about East Tennessee and the war over there, from Knoxville back in this direction. Yep, Goff. Richard D. Goff, Confederate Supply, published by Duke University Press. Fascinating book, really good book. And I was disappointed. So someone else, I think it was Longacre, wrote a book on supply, and which I also have. And in the introduction, he says that there's not enough information to write about Confederate supply. So most of that book, which I have read, deals with supplying Union troops. Whereas, Goff had already, I have no idea if I'm saying that right or wrong, had already written this marvelous book 50 years ago on the subject. And that book definitely needs to be on your Confederate bookshelf. Hey, we could talk about having a Union bookshelf too, or a Federal bookshelf. I don't know what books I would put on there. Of course, Life of Billy Yank would go on there. I don't spend a lot of time reading about the Federal side, but that's okay. Well, I probably won't ever get to that one. All right, folks, anything else you want to drop in there? Please let me know. And of course, I will be reviewing, and maybe we'll even try and track down the author of the Confederate Navy Medical Corps when I get the book done. And we'll see if he'll jump online. But we're going to be having a program in the 1st of May about Confederate spies. And I encourage you to come check it out. So yes, I've just created a market rush on Confederate supply. So I have like 10 copies of it here. And of course, the price has gone up today since we brought up. I'm just kidding. Yeah, my Federal bookshelf is a lot of 1700s and 1800s as well, Jason. I've got stuff on the Supreme Court and justices and presidents and the Declaration and the Constitution. But I do have Federal books as well of the 1860 time period, and I have read them, biographies on like Burnside and McClellan. I've even read on Grant and Sherman. It's just part of the job, but that's okay. Awesome. So, my friends, that's where we're at. If you got anything else, drop it in the notes, and I'll take a stab at it. Otherwise, I'll be signing off for the evening and getting ready for our action-packed week. See where we get to go this week. Actually, we're going to be finishing up the World War II chapter, aviation chapter, North Carolina Aviation Project. So that's where a lot of this week will go. That chapter will be done really soon, and it may be the biggest chapter in the book. But that's okay. A fit representation of pandemonium. Is that a book? East Tennessee Confederate soldiers in the campaign for Vicksburg. I don't know if I've ever heard of it. If that's a book, I don't think I've ever heard of that one. But hey, we could do other states like that as well. It's a book. Well, cool. I don't have that one, but that's okay. All right, folks, I will be signing off for this evening. Y'all have a fantastic week. Continue to research, share history, because, it's a one-on-one conversation usually out there, and learn and share, and just continue to do that, and maybe we can make a difference. That's all we can do. Y'all have a fantastic week, and I look forward, Lord willing, to seeing most of you next week, if I'm not pooped out of my tree. And God bless.